Hi, my name is David Kelsey, and today we'll be talking about categorical syllogisms, and we'll be learning how to evaluate those guys to see if they're valid or invalid. Right. So the method we're going to be working with today regarding the evaluation of categorical syllogisms to determine if they're valid or invalid is what's called the rules method. And the rules method is really, the reason I use it and I teach it and I like it so much is that it's really pretty straightforward, right? The kind of idea here is that there are three rules, and if a categorical syllogism breaks one of the rules, it is invalid. And it's that simple. So a categorical syllogism that breaks all three rules would be invalid. One that breaks two rules is invalid, but it just takes one rule to break of these three for a categorical syllogism to be invalid. So of course, if a categorical syllogism passes all three rules, then it would be a valid argument. All right, that's the idea. So the three rules of the rules method that we're going to learn here go like this. The first one says that the number of negative claims must match. Okay, so the idea is sort of like this, right? The number of negative claims you have in the premises must equal or match the number of negative claims you have in the conclusion. Okay, now if you remember, the negative claims are the E claims, sort of like no tigers are plants. That would be an E claim, right? That's negative, right? The O claims are also negative. So, for example, some tigers are not plants, right? That's also a negative claim. So E and O claims are negative. And so the idea is if an argument has those in it, right, they have to equal, right? The number of premises that are negative have to equal the number of conclusions that are negative. Now, of course, in an argument, in a categorical syllogism, there's only one conclusion, right? So this means a couple things. First, if a categorical syllogism has two negative premises, it's automatically invalid because this rule's failed, right? Can't have two negative conclusions. You can only have one because there is only one. So if you have two negative premises, automatically rule one fails and the argument is invalid. Okay? Secondly, though, obviously, if there's a negative premise, the conclusion would have to be negative, right? It has to equal in that sense. One negative premise and a negative conclusion, and the rule would pass, actually, right? If you have a negative premise and an affirmative conclusion, the rule is going to fail. Okay? And then lastly, obviously, if none of the premises are negative, the conclusion would have to be affirmative as well, right? So if you have, say, two A claims in the premises, you'd have to have an A or an I claim in the conclusion for Rule 1 to pass. Okay? Okay, so that is the first rule. And for me, I always check that rule first because it is the most sort of simple rule there is, right? To understand. The second and third are, I would say a bit more complex. Okay, so for the second rule, it says at least one premise must distribute the middle term. Okay? And also notice the third rule here. The second rule is that at least one premise must distribute the middle term. The third rule also applies the idea of distribution. And it says any term distributed in the conclusion must also be distributed in the premises. Okay? So in both of these rules, 2 and 3, we're applying a concept called distribution. Okay, so we really have to kind of study and understand distribution before we can understand rules 2 and 3, right? Which is what we're going to try to do now. Okay, the first thing to understand about distribution is that a claim distributes a term. Okay, we don't say that an argument distributes a term. All right, and a lot of my students, especially in the online course and so on, will make a kind of mistake here about a misunderstanding about what it means to say that a term is distributed. And I think the mistake that's made here really is that for me it seems there's a sense of distribution which I think a lot of people take to mean something like shared, right? So distribution and shared kind of have a similar This seemed to be like synonyms, right? Similar meaning. Shared and distributed, or something like this. And so I think a lot of my students in the past have made this mistake of thinking that a distributed term is just one that's shared across the argument. For example, if you have a term that's occurring in the first premise and also in the conclusion, right? That means it's shared. That means it's distributed across the whole of the argument, okay? And I think that's the kind of thing that's confusing a bit, is that's completely incorrect way of thinking, okay? And so we don't really mean when we say a term is distributed that it's distributed across the argument. Instead, I think the way to think about distribution is that a claim distributes a term just in case the claim says something about every member of the class the term refers to. Another way to put it, which I think maybe makes sense of the idea of distributing, is that a claim distributes a term just in case it distributes over everything the term is about. It's kind of a simple way to put it, right? In case it distributes over every member of the class the term is referring to, right? Okay, so let's try an example maybe to get the point here. So take the claim all tigers are mammals, an A claim. So an A claim, all tigers are mammals, you have to just simply ask, does that claim, all tigers are mammals, distribute over every tiger? Does it say something about every tiger? Is it about every tiger? Right? That's kind of the idea. And if it is, then that claim distributes the term tigers. That's the point, right? So if you think about the claim, right, all tigers are mammals, it of course says something about every tiger. It distributes over every member of that class of, animals, right? And so A claims like that distribute the subject term. In this case, the claim all tigers are mammals distributes the term tigers, right? Okay. Now, to see the point even further, let's look at the term mammals in that claim. All tigers are mammals. The predicate term there is mammals. Does that claim say something about every mammal? Does it distribute over that entire class? If you think about it, all tigers are mammals. It doesn't, right? It says something about every tiger, but of course there's all sorts of mammals that aren't tigers. So the claim really doesn't distribute, it doesn't flex, it doesn't say something about every single mammal. And so the A claim, all tigers are mammals, does not distribute the term mammals. It only distributes the term tigers. And actually, if you think about A claims sort of more generally, they're always going to distribute the subject term and then not distribute the predicate term, right? Okay, so then next, we can think about the E claim, right? So what about a claim like no sharks or trees? So again, all we have to ask, right? Again, we're asking if that claim, no sharks or trees, distributes the term sharks, and does it distribute the term trees? Okay, that's the question. So let's take a look. All we have to really ask is, does the claim no sharks or trees say something about, does it distribute over every single shark? And the answer seems to be yes, right? In particular, it says that none of them can be trees, right? So an E claim like no sharks or trees distributes the term sharks. Okay, secondly, right, look at the term trees in that claim. Does that claim say something about every single tree? It does actually, right? It seems to say, in fact, that they can't be sharks, right? So the E claim, no sharks or trees, in fact, distributes both the term sharks and the term trees. It distributes both terms, right? And that's how E claims go. E claims distribute both terms. Okay, you saw that A claims only distribute the subject term, not the predicate. E claims distribute both, right? Okay, so then what about the I claim some snakes are poisonous creatures, right? What about that one? So all we have to do again is ask whether that claim, right? Whether that claim says something about every single member of each of those two terms, right? Those classes, right? So does the claim, some snakes are poisonous creatures, say something about every single snake? No, it doesn't, right? It doesn't say something about every single snake because it's just talking about a few of them, some of them, right? And of course, there could be lots that aren't poisonous, right? So the term snakes is not distributed by the I claim some snakes are poisonous creatures. Now, what about the term poisonous creatures, the predicate here, right? Is that distributed? It isn't, right? Because the claim some snakes are poisonous creatures isn't about all poisonous creatures either, right? In fact, it seems to just suggest that some of those are snakes or something, right? Or some snakes are those. So, nevertheless, I claims like this don't distribute either term, right? They don't distribute the subject or the predicate term. So if you think about what we've seen so far, A claims distribute only the subject term, E claims distribute both terms, and the I claim distributes neither, right? Now, lastly, the O claim is actually going to just distribute the predicate term, right? And if you think about it, that is a really nice kind of tool to memorize how this distribution goes, right? Because the pattern here, right, is kind of easy to recognize, right? The A claim distributes the subject term, and the O claim only distributes the predicate, right? And then you have the E distributing both terms and the I distributed neither, right? So you have a kind of pattern, a symmetry there, and it's an easy way to think about distribution to help you learn, right? And if you think back to the three rules now, we can kind of understand, what they say and what they mean, right? We've learned what distribution is, and since we now know what distribution is, we now can apply what we know to understand rules 2 and 3 of the rules method, right? So again, back to the rules method, the first rule says that the number of negative claims in the premises must match the number of negative claims in the conclusion. Okay, we get that one. We've talked about that one so far, but rule 2 then says that at least one premise must distribute the middle term. So we just talked about distribution. So again, the idea now is you have to find in your categorical syllogism to test this rule, you have to find the middle term, and then you have to ask if in either case where it occurs, right, either premise 1 or premise 2, it's distributed by the claim it's in, right? And so we just have to test the middle term in both cases to see if it's distributed in either case, right? Is it distributed in the first premise? No, well, maybe it's distributed in the second, right? So we have to kind of check it to see if it's distributed just once. And that's what the rule says. It says that it must be distributed in one of the premises. It doesn't have to be distributed in both, right? Just at least one, okay? Now, if it passes that rule, that brings us to the third rule. The third rule says that if a term is distributed in the conclusion, it must also be distributed in the premises. Okay, so understand that this rule kind of goes bottom up, right? It basically says that anything that's distributed, any term distributed in the conclusion must also be distributed in the premises of the argument. So essentially what we do here is we check in the conclusion to see if it's distributing either term. If it does distribute a term there, we've got to find that term in the premises and then determine if it's also distributed there in the premises. And if it is, well then that's fine. The rule will pass, right? Okay, so that being said then, let's go ahead and we're going to try some examples. We're going to apply the rules method to a few categorical syllogisms to determine if those categorical syllogisms are valid or not, right? We've got a few examples to work with now. So the first example, it says this. It says, 1, all football players are soccer players. 2, some soccer players are not surfers. Therefore, 3, some football players are not surfers. Okay? You can see here that you've got as your first premise an A claim. Your second premise is an O claim. And your conclusion is an O claim as well, right? Your terms are football players, soccer players, and surfers. Okay? So we do have a categorical syllogism. So now what we've got to do is test this categorical syllogism to see if it's valid or invalid, right? And the way we do that, again, is we look at the 3 rules. And we apply the rules to the argument. If it fails the rule, then the argument's invalid, right? Okay, so the first rule, right, if you remember, says that the negatives must match, right? The number of negative premises must match the number of negative conclusions, right? Now, if we look at this argument, you can see that the first premise is an A claim and so is not negative. But then the second premise is an O claim, right? Some soccer players are not surfers. That one is negative, right? So we have a negative premise. We've got to have, for this rule to pass, we've got to have a negative conclusion. But if you notice, we do, right? The conclusion is also an O claim. Some football players are not surfers. That's an O claim. So rule 1 here is going to pass. We have a negative premise and a negative conclusion. Okay? Now what about rule 2? Rule 2 says that the middle term has to be distributed in at least one of the premises. Just one, right? So the middle term here, if you notice, is soccer players. All right? Now, soccer players occurs as, in the first premise, as the predicate of an A claim. Okay? Now, if you remember, A claims distribute only the subject term. And so they do not distribute the predicate term. And so soccer players here is not distributed in the first premise. But you'll notice now the second premise says some soccer players are not surfers. Here, soccer players occurs as the subject of an O claim. But now think back, right? O claims only distribute the predicate term. Right? So here, rule 2 fails because the middle term, soccer players, not distributed in either of the two premises. Right? Okay. Now, obviously, because rule 2 has failed, the argument is invalid, right? But let's just, learn the rules, let's just think about applying the third rule to the argument to see if it passes that or not, right? So the third rule says that if a term is distributed in the conclusion, it must also be distributed in the premises. Now, you could look here at the conclusion of this argument is an O claim. An O claim distributes its predicate term, which is surfers. Okay? So for rule 3 to pass, for this argument, surfers must also be distributed in the premises, in particular in the second premise where it occurs, right? And so you notice that surfers there is occurring also as the predicate of an O claim. And so it's distributed also in the second premise. So this argument actually passes rule 3, and it also passes rule 1, but it fails rule 2, right? Because the middle term, which is soccer players, right? Not distributed in either of the premises, and so therefore, because it breaks rule 2, the argument is invalid, right? Okay. Our next example is burgers, pizza, and beer, right? 3 of my favorite things. Okay, so no burger joints are pizza places. Some pizza places are bars, right? And some burger joints are bars. Okay, simple argument, right? Now, if you look straight away, let's just think immediately about how to apply the rules here. Get a bit quicker about it, right? So the first rule says that negatives must match. If you look here, right, our first premise says no burger joints or pizza places. That's a negative claim. It's an E claim, right? So then that means for rule 1 to pass, our conclusion must also be negative, right? And our conclusion is that some burger joints are bars, not a negative claim. So this one immediately fails rule 1, and so is invalid. Right? It's invalid because it fails rule 1. Now again, just to practice our skills a little bit, let's check rules 2 and 3 to see if those pass. Even though the argument is invalid because it's failed rule 1, we don't really need to check rules 2 and 3, but let's practice our skill at doing that, right? So we can get a bit better, right? So if you check rule 2 here, the middle term, right? It's got to be distributed in one of the premises. The middle term is pizza places, right? So pizza places, you'll see here, occurs in the first premise, as the predicate of an E claim. And of course, E claims distribute both terms. So actually, pizza places, the middle term, distributed in the first premise, and so that rule passes, rule 2, right? Now, what about rule 3? Rule 3 says that any term distributed in the conclusion must also be distributed in the premises. But you'll notice here something interesting about the conclusion. The conclusion is an I claim, right? Some burger joints are bars. But I claims don't distribute either term, right? But now if you think back to rule 3, what it says is that if the conclusion distributes a term, it also must be distributed in the premises. But here the conclusion isn't distributing a term, so therefore rule 3 passes. And that's a really nice point, actually, is that anytime you have an I claim in the conclusion, rule 3 is going to pass sort of automatic, right? The other point too, I think, if you think about rule 2, right, rule 2 says that the middle term must be distributed in one of the premises, but you'll notice in our example here, we had an E claim for one of the premises. E claims distribute both terms, and so if of course, you have an E claim in your premises, that means automatically, since your middle term is in that premise, of course, it's going to be distributed there. So an E claim automatically in the premises automatically gets you a pass on Rule 2. And then, as I said, an I claim automatically in the conclusion gets you a pass on Rule 3. Okay? So just some kind of shortcuts, if you will. Okay, so the last example we'll look at for this lecture is tree-hugging hippies, independents, and believable people. Okay? So the argument says, no tree-hugging hippies are independents. All tree-hugging hippies are believable people. Therefore, no believable people are independents. Okay? Now, straight away we can test the rules, right? So Rule 1 says the negatives must match, but we see here that they do, right? Because premise 1 is negative, but so is the conclusion, right? Premise 1 is an E claim, and so also the conclusion is an E claim. So that's Rule 1's going to pass, right? What about Rule 2? Rule 2 says the middle term has to be distributed. The middle term here is tree-hugging hippies. But you can see actually that tree-hugging hippies is distributed in both terms. It occurs as the subject of an E and the subject of an A claim. And E claims distribute both terms and A claims distribute the subject. So actually Rule 2 passes as well for both instances of the middle term. It's distributed twice. Lastly, let's look at Rule 3. So look, Rule 3 is kind of this one that goes bottom up, right? It says that if a term is distributed in the conclusion, it must also be distributed in the premises. You can see here that our conclusion is an E claim. And E claims, if you remember, distribute both terms, right? So when you have that, right, obviously you have to check that both of those terms are also distributed in the premises of the argument. And if they are, then of course the rule is going to pass. So we've got to check both the terms believable people and independents in our premises to see if they're distributed there, and if so, then the rule would pass, right? So let's check first believable people. Believable people occurs in premise 2 as the predicate of an A claim, right? So do A claims distribute the predicate term? They do not, right? So we can see straight away that believable people is distributed in the conclusion, but not in the second premise. And so that means Rule 3 fails. So that means that this argument is also invalid, right? Okay, well that is it for today then, guys. I hope you really enjoyed the lesson. And again, I think with these really trying to learn the rules method is all about practice, right? We have to try to understand the rules, and then we just have to work the exercises that are in our book, and you know, just have to kind of get moving with it and work our skills with the rules method, and then we'll get it, you know. So hope you enjoyed the lesson, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.